Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when bedtime meant something very different. When the walls were stone, the floors were dirt, and the nearest thing to central heating was the faint memory of a dying fire. So, tuck yourself under whatever blanket you've got, and let's wander softly into the question that's been keeping historians, and perhaps insomniacs, mildly curious for centuries. How did medieval peasants actually sleep without freezing to death? Because they shouldn't have survived, really. Their homes were small, windowless boxes built mostly to keep the wind out, which they only sort of managed. The typical peasant house in northern Europe, around the 13th or 14th century, was made of fieldstone or timber plastered with mud, charmingly described by later writers as rustic, though that's a generous way of saying it smelled of goats and smoke. The roof? Thatch, packed tight with straw and often home to an extended family of mice, spiders, and the occasional bird that just moved in. Inside, things weren't much cozier. The hearth was the heart of the home, but it wasn't the blazing, fireplace-mental sort of hearth we imagine. More like a blackened pit in the center of the floor, where wood, damp, smoky wood, burned unevenly. The smoke had nowhere to go except upward, into the thatch, and then, ideally, out through a hole in the roof. Ideally being the operative word. In reality, most of it hung in the air, giving the interior that pleasant campfire meets lung damage aroma so characteristic of medieval living. So yes, they were cold. Constantly. And yet, somehow, they slept. Let's start with the bed, or what counted as one. Few peasants owned a proper bed frame. Most slept on what were called bed benches or just piles of straw laid on the floor. Sometimes they'd use old sacks stuffed with reeds or chaff, the discarded husks of wheat, which, in theory, added comfort, though in practice it mostly added itching. Sheets were rare luxuries. Instead, you'd have rough wool blankets or maybe, if you were lucky, a linen sheet that had been washed enough times to not feel like sandpaper. And remember, these houses weren't divided into cozy rooms. Everyone, parents, children, possibly grandparents, and occasionally livestock, all shared the same space. The family cow might even be tethered inside for warmth. So, imagine dozing off to sleep while a cow chews methodically beside your straw pallet. Peaceful, perhaps, in its own earthy way. But it wasn't just poverty that shaped this odd sleep arrangement, it was practicality. Heat was precious, and bodies were the best heaters available. Families slept close, not out of sentimentality, but survival. The combined warmth of several people under one rough blanket could make the difference between discomfort and frostbite. So, when winter came, everyone just huddled in, like a human lasagna of necessity. Interestingly, peasants didn't sleep in one long stretch the way we do now. The 8-hour night is a modern invention, a post-industrial luxury. Medieval folks practiced what's called segmented sleep, 2 distinct sleep periods with a waking hour in between. They'd drift off after sundown, wake up around midnight, tend the fire, pray, or, more pragmatically, check the animals or relieve themselves. Then, after an hour or two, they'd crawl back under the blanket for their second sleep. And really, that in-between time sounds rather nice, quiet, half-dreaming, the room faintly glowing from embers, maybe a whispered conversation or a muttered prayer. In that silence, they might have felt oddly content. The world outside was cold and dark, but inside, smoky, crowded, imperfect as it was, there was at least the warmth of breathing bodies and the crackle of a fading fire. Now, not everyone had even that. In the poorest cottages, there might not be straw bedding at all, just bare earth. People would rake up rushes or dried grass to soften it, then spread old cloth or animal skins on top. The result wasn't comfortable, exactly, but it was something. And if you're wondering whether they were cold, yes. Desperately. But the human body is resilient, and the medieval body even more so. Centuries of hardship trained people to tolerate discomfort that would send most of us diving for the thermostat. Of course, the wealthy slept very differently, which feels important and slightly unfair to mention. While peasants nestled in smoky huts, nobles were surrounded by feather mattresses, fur coverlets, and enormous canopied beds that doubled as status symbols. Those elaborate beds weren't just for sleeping, they were platforms for ceremony, conversation, and occasionally, dramatic sulking. A peasant's bed was for warmth and survival. A lord's bed was practically a throne that happened to be horizontal. Ironically, though, those great halls were still drafty and freezing. Thick stone castles trapped dampness like sponges, and without glass windows or proper insulation, even nobility slept beneath mountains of blankets, sometimes wearing nightcaps and gloves. So, comfort, it seems, was relative and elusive. But peasants had an advantage the nobles didn't. They were used to hardship. The body adapts, the mind adjusts, and over time, what seems unbearable becomes ordinary. There's something almost meditative about that. The rhythm of survival, the gathering of wood, the tending of fire, the ritual of bedding down beside family, became a nightly practice of endurance. Perhaps, in its own rough way, it was peace. Speaking of peace, the medieval night wasn't entirely still. Villages were alive with soft sounds, the shuffle of animals, the creak of wood, the distant bark of a dog. Occasionally, there'd be a rooster who hadn't figured out time properly, announcing dawn at 2 in the morning. And, depending on the season, the wind could howl through the gaps in the wall with a persistence that felt almost personal. Some historians suggest that peasants often slept with their heads covered, wrapping cloth or hoods around themselves to trap warmth and avoid breathing too much smoke. Not exactly comfortable, but effective. And as strange as it sounds, the combination of smoke, darkness, and exhaustion probably helped them sleep faster than most of us can manage with blackout curtains and white noise machines. We imagine medieval people as constantly miserable, but it's worth remembering, they didn't know what they were missing. When your entire life is bound by the rhythm of daylight and the limits of your hearth, you don't yearn for duvets or scented candles. You simply sleep when it's dark, wake when it's light, and hope your thatch doesn't catch fire overnight, which, unfortunately, did happen rather often. The thatch roof, filled with dry straw and embers rising from the hearth, was the medieval equivalent of living inside a slow-burning candle. Let's drift for a moment to the smells, because yes, bedtime came with a particular fragrance. Smoke, sweat, livestock, and straw all mixed into something uniquely medieval. To our modern noses, it might be unbearable. To theirs, it was simply home. And perhaps that's the point. Comfort is subjective. A medieval peasant slipping under a scratchy wool blanket after a day of field work probably felt just as relieved as we do when we collapse onto memory foam. Still, they had their small comforts. Some would heat stones in the fire and wrap them in cloth to place at their feet, a primitive hot water bottle. Others slept beside the family pig, who radiated more heat than any stone ever could. And for those in colder regions, like Scandinavia, sleeping platforms were sometimes built above the hearth itself, so that rising warmth could be trapped beneath them. Ingenious, in a slightly smoky, lung-blackening way. The rhythm of night shaped their dreams too. Sleep, in those smoky huts, must have felt different, deeper, darker, punctuated by real silence. Without artificial light, their circadian rhythms were perfectly aligned with the sun. Imagine how quiet a medieval night truly was, no traffic, no hum of electricity, just the faint crackle of fire and the steady breathing of those around you. The stillness must have been absolute, eerie, and comforting at once. And perhaps that's why sleep held such spiritual meaning. The medieval mind saw sleep as a rehearsal for death, a daily surrender to the unknown. Prayers before bed weren't just habit, they were a small act of courage. If I die before I wake, as the old rhyme goes, wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was a realistic concern in a world of disease, fire, and cold nights. Yet, despite everything, they survived. Generations upon generations slept through winters that would freeze our modern pipes solid. They adapted, layering wool, sharing warmth, sleeping in shifts, and accepting cold as a fact of existence rather than a crisis. That resilience is quietly impressive. When morning came, they'd stir from the straw, rake the ashes, coax the fire back to life, and begin again, a rhythm older than comfort, yet somehow enduring. We might laugh at the idea of sleeping beside cows and soot, but there's a strange coziness in it, too. A communal sort of intimacy modern life has lost. They weren't alone, scrolling through the night, they were together, even in sleep. Maybe that's the lesson buried under all that straw: survival wasn't solitary. Warmth came from others, literally. So the next time you pull up your duvet and complain about a draft, just remember, somewhere in the 14th century, a family of 7 and a cow are huddled together on a floor of packed dirt, and they're managing just fine. And that's how medieval peasants, against all architectural logic, managed to sleep through the freezing nights in their stone huts. With smoke, straw, shared warmth, and a level of endurance that's quietly astonishing. But we've only drifted through the surface of medieval sleep. In the next part, we'll wander deeper into the strange superstitions, bedtime prayers, and surprisingly complicated relationship medieval people had with the dark itself. Until then, tell me in the comments, could you have survived a medieval winter night without your blanket, heater, or phone? Or would you have made friends with the family pig for warmth? I'm curious, and so were they. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've made it past the straw beds and the smoky air. If you drifted off somewhere between the cow and the hot stone foot warmers, that's perfectly fine too. That's kind of the point, really. But for those of you still with me, let's ease back into the medieval night, that strange world between sunset and sunrise, where sleep wasn't just rest, it was ritual, superstition, and sometimes, a little bit of fear. Because medieval people didn't think of sleep the way we do. Today, we treat it as something mechanical: 8 hours to reset the brain, recharge, and try not to check your phone halfway through. But to them, sleep was mystical. It was a brush with the divine, or the demonic, depending on the night. You closed your eyes not knowing if you'd wake up, and that wasn't just poetic melancholy. It was reality. Cold, hunger, and sickness made every bedtime a small gamble. So before bed, they prayed. Always. A peasant might kneel beside their straw pallet, whispering a version of the familiar "Now I lay me down to sleep," centuries before the rhyme existed. Nobles did it too, but with fancier Latin and embroidered cushions. The sentiment was the same: "Lord, please let me wake up." Because if you didn't, well, that was between you and eternity. And of course, there were other dangers besides death. There were things that visited in the night. You see, medieval Europe was very sure that sleep left the body vulnerable, not just to illness, but to spirits. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams, they were demons pressing down on your chest, suffocating you as you lay paralyzed. The word nightmare itself comes from Mara, an evil spirit believed to sit on your chest and steal your breath. It's what we now call sleep paralysis, but back then, it was personal. If you woke up unable to move, heart pounding, they didn't say you're having a neurological misfire. They said, "Ah yes, a demon sat on you." Comforting, in its own way. People took precautions. Crosses were hung above beds. Prayers were whispered against the night hag. Some even carried charms or placed iron tools beside the bed, because apparently, evil spirits were easily frightened by metalwork. If you were particularly worried, you could sprinkle holy water around your sleeping space. Though honestly, if you lived in a thatched hut full of hay, that probably created more problems than it solved. And yet, despite all these fears, sleep was sacred. Dreaming was seen as a form of communication, messages from God, or occasionally, the devil. Kings, saints, and peasants alike looked for meaning in their dreams. A dream of bread might mean fortune, a dream of wolves, danger. There were dream manuals circulating in monasteries, entire books explaining what your subconscious was trying to tell you. Think of them as the medieval version of dream interpretation TikTok, but with more Latin and fewer hashtags. The night itself was a world apart. When the sun set, life didn't stop, it simply changed tone. Villages grew quiet. The air cooled. And the candlelight turned everything gold and uncertain. Most families owned only a single tallow candle, smoky, smelly, made from animal fat, so darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a presence. People navigated their huts by memory and touch. You could hear more than you could see: the shifting straw, the soft breathing of others, the occasional creak that might have been wood, or something else entirely. It's strange to think about how dark true darkness is, something most of us never really experience anymore. Medieval nights were total. Step outside your door, and the world disappeared into shadow. That's part of why bedtime was so early. There was simply nothing else to do. Once the fire dimmed and the candle burned low, the night belonged to other things. And not all of them were friendly. The medieval imagination filled the night with things unseen: ghosts, witches, restless souls. It wasn't just fear of the dark, it was respect for it. The dark was God's domain, or perhaps the devil's. Ordinary folk didn't wander out unless absolutely necessary, and if they did, they carried a lantern, muttering prayers as they went. Because, naturally, everyone knew someone whose cousin's friend had once met a ghost near the mill after dusk. So, most people stayed inside, trusting that the fire, and maybe a crucifix, would hold the darkness at bay. It's easy to laugh at those fears, but remember, there were no police patrols, no streetlights, no noise to break the silence. Just the long, endless night and whatever your imagination could conjure. In that context, the idea of demons and wandering spirits seems almost reasonable. The line between the real and the unreal blurred at midnight, especially during that quiet hour between first and second sleep. This was the watch, the period when people woke naturally in the middle of the night. It wasn't insomnia, it was just how human sleep worked before electricity. Some used that time to pray. Others might talk softly, share secrets, or engage in other forms of marital bonding, shall we say, before drifting back off. Monks, meanwhile, took it literally, rising for midnight prayers, chanting in the dark cloisters, their breath misting in the cold air. For peasants, it was simpler. The fire would have burned low, so someone might stir to add more wood or rearrange the coals. Children might whimper, and parents would murmur them back to sleep. It was a soft, human rhythm, this halfway waking world, neither day nor night. There's something oddly peaceful about it. The idea of having a built-in pause, time to reflect, to breathe, before diving back into dreams. Our modern lives could probably use a bit of that. Let's drift, for a moment, into the way people actually positioned themselves in bed. Sleeping flat on one's back wasn't common, it was thought unhealthy and even spiritually risky, as that was the posture of the dead. Most slept curled up on their sides, knees bent, bodies huddled together for warmth. And they didn't change clothes for bed. There were no pajamas, just whatever you'd worn that day, maybe with an extra layer thrown on. If you had the luxury of a nightcap, you wore it, not as a fashion statement, but to stop your ears from freezing. And yes, the classic image of a nightshirt and floppy cap did exist. It wasn't as cute as Christmas cards make it look, though. Picture more rough-spun linen, a few stains, and the faint smell of smoke. Beds were sometimes shared with guests, too, not for scandalous reasons, but simply because space and warmth were limited. Traveling merchants, servants, even pilgrims might end up sharing a pallet with strangers. It was called bundling, and while it sounds awkward, it was normal. You just turned your back politely and tried to sleep. Privacy was a modern invention, survival was the priority. The air in those homes, though, it must have been thick. Smoke from the hearth mixed with the scent of wool, sweat, and damp straw. The walls themselves seemed to absorb it all. Opening a door in the morning must have felt like breathing for the first time. And yet, oddly enough, that smoke played a useful role. It helped preserve the thatch from rot and kept insects away. So while it probably shaved a few years off everyone's lifespan, it also kept the fleas in check. Life is trade-offs. Speaking of fleas, yes, they were everywhere. Bedbugs, lice, fleas, a nightly trinity of irritation. People tried herbs to repel them, lavender, mint, tansy, but they were fighting a losing battle. Still, you adapt. Eventually, a few bites stop mattering when you've spent all day plowing fields or hauling firewood. You just scratch, sigh, and drift off again. In the monasteries, meanwhile, things were different but not necessarily better. Monks slept in long dormitories, each in his narrow bed, rising at fixed hours for prayers. Silence was absolute, and the cold? Unrelenting. They believed comfort invited sin, so their beds were plain, their blankets thin, their rooms drafty. Imagine being half asleep, wrapped in rough wool, hearing the bell ring for midnight psalms, and trudging out into the dark to chant in an unheated chapel. It's devotion, or insomnia disguised as holiness. But beyond religion and fleas, there's something deeply human about all this. The shared struggle against the cold, the rituals of bedtime, the little comforts, it connects us across centuries. Whether it's a hot stone in a peasant's hut or an electric blanket in a city apartment, it's the same instinct, to make the dark a little warmer, a little safer. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't as miserable as we imagine. Because when you strip away luxury, what's left is simplicity, the honest tiredness of a day's work, the satisfaction of being together. There's something grounding in that. The stars overhead, the fire's glow, the rhythm of breath. They didn't need sleep apps or soundscapes. Their entire world was one. So perhaps medieval sleep wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about finding peace within it. Amid the smoke, the cold, and the superstition, there was still that quiet moment, the sigh before drifting off, that belonged only to them. When dawn came, it wasn't a gentle alarm clock. It was the rooster, the church bell, or just the first gray light creeping through the cracks in the shutters. The fire would be coaxed back to life, and the day began again. Hard, cold, and unrelenting, but familiar. And as they rose from their straw pallets, stretching stiff limbs, maybe they looked back at that heap of blankets and thought, not comfortable, but enough. Because enough was all they needed to survive another night. So, the next time you grumble about your mattress being too firm or your room a bit chilly, remember, you are living better than a medieval lord ever did. And if you really want to sleep like a 14th century peasant, just turn off your heat, invite a cow into your bedroom, and share one blanket with your entire family. Guaranteed authenticity, though your landlord might disagree. Let's end tonight's journey here, between the smoke and the stars, and that strange, quiet world where humanity first learned to share warmth against the dark. Tell me in the comments, would you have survived medieval bedtime, or would you have traded your soul for a space heater? I'd love to know. Now, settle back, close your eyes, and let the medieval night carry you off. Because it's cold out there, but somehow, they always found a way to sleep. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's impressive. You've made it through straw mattresses, smoky huts, and a very cozy assortment of livestock roommates. But tonight, we're drifting somewhere stranger, into the world of dreams. Because once a medieval peasant managed to fall asleep, the mind didn't rest. It wandered. And in those dark, flickering hours, dreams could mean anything from divine revelation to full-blown possession. You see, medieval people took dreams seriously. Very seriously. To them, a dream wasn't just the brain's nightly screensaver, it was a window into the soul. Every symbol, every image, every odd moment carried weight. If you dreamt of bread, it might mean blessing. If you dreamt of teeth falling out, perhaps an omen of death. And if you dreamt of pigs, well, that could go either way, depending on how clean the pig was. But dreams weren't just personal curiosities, they were messages. Divine post, if you will. God, the Virgin Mary, saints, angels, all of them were believed to communicate through dreams. The Bible was full of sleeping prophets and holy visions, after all. So naturally, the medieval imagination was primed to take every midnight hallucination as cosmic correspondence. For the peasantry, dream interpretation often came through the church. Priests, monks, and even wandering wise women claimed to know the meanings behind dreams. There were dream books, manuscripts filled with neat explanations. To dream of water, one might say, is to expect sorrow. To dream of fire, another read, is to beware of passion. One of the more famous manuals was the Somnial Danielis, essentially, Daniel's Dream Guide, a bestseller of the Middle Ages, passed around monasteries like a medieval self-help book. But for all their fascination, dreams were also dangerous. Because not every dream was divine. Some came, people believed, from darker sources. Demons, ever eager to ruin a good night's rest, could slip into a sleeper's mind and plant wicked thoughts. That's where nightmares came from, literally nightmares, those suffocating spirits that pressed on your chest and whispered in your ear. If you'd ever woken up in the middle of the night unable to move, convinced someone was sitting on you, congratulations, you've experienced what medieval Europe called a hag attack. They didn't know about REM paralysis, of course. They just knew it felt real, the pressure, the terror, the sense that something was watching. So they gave it a name. Sometimes the culprit was the Mara, a female demon who crept in through cracks or keyholes. Other times it was a dead soul, returning to torment the living. One of the most vivid medieval descriptions of such a visitation comes from the 12th century. A man, half asleep, felt a great weight pressing on him, as though a millstone lay upon his breast. He tried to cry out, but his voice failed. And when he finally awoke, gasping, there was no one there, just the embers of the fire and the long, silent dark. Naturally, he concluded it was a demon. Because of course it was. The church didn't help much. On one hand, priests warned that dreams could be divine messages, on the other, they might be satanic traps. Conveniently, only the church could tell which was which. That ambiguity gave medieval Christians an endless source of anxiety. Every dream required interpretation, but interpretation was risky business. Get it wrong, and you might accidentally credit the devil with divine work. For ordinary people, this meant a strange kind of nightly vigilance. Before bed, prayers weren't just for safety, they were for purity of dreams. The idea was simple: keep your thoughts clean before sleeping, and your dreams will follow. So, no lustful thinking, no gluttony, no vengeful plotting, because in a world where thoughts could attract demons, even imagination was dangerous territory. Still, not all dreams were fearful. Many were comforting, even holy. Saints were said to appear in dreams to offer guidance, especially during illness or grief. Dead relatives might visit too, bringing warnings or blessings. The boundary between life and death was thin, and in dreams, it seemed to vanish entirely. And then, of course, there were prophetic dreams, the kind kings took very seriously. Royal courts often employed astrologers and interpreters who specialized in dream analysis. If a monarch dreamt of a broken sword, it might mean betrayal. If he dreamt of climbing a hill, victory. There's even a record of King Henry I supposedly dreaming of blood-red water before the sinking of the White Ship, a disaster that wiped out his heir and plunged England into chaos. Naturally, no one took it seriously until afterward, which is how most prophecies work. For peasants, dreams were smaller, but not less important. A dream of full barns or fat animals was cause for hope. A dream of empty fields, a warning. Mothers prayed for their children's peaceful dreams, a kind of nightly protection against the invisible. And sometimes, people believed that if they slept in a particular holy place, their dreams would be blessed. Pilgrims would rest overnight in chapels or near saints' relics, hoping for visions. It was called incubation, sleeping in the presence of the divine to receive healing or answers. Of course, not every dream was spiritual. Some were just weird. Monks, especially, wrote about their struggle to stay pure even in sleep. Theologians argued about whether sinful dreams counted as actual sins. Augustine, the early Christian thinker, worried deeply about this. He wrote that even if the body sinned in sleep, the soul did not consent, therefore it wasn't damning. Which is good news for anyone who's ever had an awkward dream about their neighbor. What's fascinating is how intertwined dreams and daily life were. In a world without clear divisions between science and superstition, everything connected. Dreams predicted harvests, marriages, deaths. They shaped decisions. A peasant might delay planting because of a bad dream. A noble might cancel a journey. Kings, popes, generals, all claimed to act on visions seen in sleep. In a sense, medieval Europe was guided by the collective subconscious. And in those long winter nights, dreams were sometimes the only escape. Life was hard, cold, hungry, repetitive, but dreams offered color. A world where the dead spoke, angels shone, and ordinary people could fly. Maybe that's why dreams mattered so much. They were a rare luxury of the mind, one that even poverty couldn't take away. But dreams could also terrify. Consider the incubus and succubus, two demonic figures blamed for unwanted nocturnal experiences. The incubus was a male demon who visited sleeping women, the succubus, a female one who targeted men. Both were said to drain vitality, a medieval explanation for nightmares, sleep paralysis, and, occasionally, awkwardly timed biology. Monks wrote anxious treatises about these encounters, trying to rationalize the unexplainable. Their conclusion? If you woke up feeling guilty, it was definitely your fault. It's easy to roll our eyes, but these ideas lasted for centuries. Even well into the Renaissance, people still claimed to be attacked by night demons. Witch trials sometimes included accusations of dream visitations, proof, supposedly, of a pact with the devil. Sleep, once a refuge, could become evidence against you. So medieval people developed a kind of spiritual sleep hygiene: prayer before bed, crosses near the pillow, a candle left burning for light. It wasn't cozy so much as defensive. Night was a battleground, and dreams were the front line. And yet, despite all the fear, there was wonder too. Dreaming was a bridge, a way to touch something greater. Pilgrims walked for days to sacred shrines, lay down beside holy relics, and slept, hoping for visions of healing. Some even claimed success. At the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, stories circulated of dream cures, people who saw the saint in sleep and woke miraculously well. Skeptics existed, of course, but for many, those stories were real enough to keep faith alive. It's almost poetic, this deep trust in the power of the unconscious, centuries before psychology. Freud would have had a field day. The night, then, was a space of duality, both divine and dangerous, peaceful and terrifying. To sleep was to surrender control, and that surrender carried meaning. Modern people chase control, alarms, sleep schedules, tracking apps. But medieval sleepers didn't have the luxury. They let go because they had to. Every night was an act of faith, that the fire wouldn't go out, that the roof would hold, that morning would come. And somehow, it always did. Imagine waking up in that pale dawn, the first smoke curling from the hearth, the world slowly taking shape again. The dreams fade, the cold bites, and life resumes. Maybe someone mutters about the strange vision they had, a white horse, a voice calling their name, and everyone nods solemnly, as if the world itself were whispering through their sleep. Because in a way, it was. Dreams, to the medieval mind, weren't interruptions. They were part of life's tapestry, woven between work, worship, and survival. Sleep wasn't just rest, it was conversation with the unseen. And maybe that's something we've lost. We treat dreams like static, meaningless, inconvenient. They treated them like poetry. So tonight, as you drift off, think of those centuries of sleepers who came before you, peasants, monks, kings, all breathing the same darkness, all dreaming beneath the same stars. The walls may be warmer now, the bed softer, but the mind? The mind still wanders through the same eternal night. And as you close your eyes later, maybe remember this: for 1,000 years, people believed that what came in dreams could change their fate. Sometimes it did. Tell me in the comments, if you lived in the Middle Ages and had a vivid dream, would you tell the priest or keep it to yourself? Either way, sweet dreams. The night's still young, and the past never really sleeps. Good evening again, traveler. If you're still awake after 3 parts of this medieval bedtime story, congratulations, you now know more about peasant sleep than most monks ever did. We've talked about how they slept, where they slept, and even what they dreamed about. But now, we turn to something just as fascinating: what happened when they didn't sleep. Because contrary to what we might imagine, medieval nights weren't always peaceful stretches of uninterrupted rest. The world after sunset was full of quiet movement, bakers at their ovens, guards on their rounds, and sometimes, far stranger things lurking in the dark. Waxing crescent moon, the two sleeps. Let's start with something we've forgotten: medieval people didn't sleep the way we do. Most didn't go to bed once and wake up once. Instead, they practiced what historians call segmented sleep, 2 distinct chunks of rest separated by an hour or 2 of wakefulness in the middle of the night. The first sleep began shortly after dusk, when the day's labor ended and fires dimmed. People drifted off early, around 8 or 9 in the evening. But after a few hours, sometime between midnight and 2, they often woke up naturally. They called it the watch, that gentle, drowsy space between the first and second sleep. During that time, people might pray, talk quietly, tend to the fire, or even visit neighbors. Some took the opportunity for intimacy, others for reflection. Monks rose for their matins, midnight prayers echoing through stone cloisters. Bakers began kneading dough by candlelight. And after an hour or two, everyone drifted back to their second sleep, a deeper, dreamier rest that carried them into dawn. The rhythm made sense. Without artificial light, human bodies naturally followed the pattern of darkness. The watch wasn't insomnia, it was ordinary. A pause in the night. Sometimes I wonder if that's what modern people are missing, that quiet, in-between hour. No phone, no noise, just the fire breathing softly and the world half asleep. Sparkle's engagement line: what would you do if you woke up every night at midnight, read, pray, or just listen to the silence? Fire the midnight chores. For peasants, the night watch wasn't just reflective, it was practical. Fires needed tending, coals had to be stirred or risked dying out. If the hearth went cold, the morning would begin with flint and struggle. So someone, usually the lightest sleeper, would rise and poke at the embers, feed them a bit of wood, maybe even heat water. In winter, that small task could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. Animals stirred, too. Cows lowed softly. Dogs shifted near the door. A rooster, confused by the moon, might crow early. For families living in one-room huts, the boundaries between human and animal life blurred completely. Night was a chorus of sighs, snores, and rustles. Sometimes, people used the waking hour to tell stories, folk tales, or family gossip whispered in the dark. The house was quiet, the children half asleep, and the voice of an elder became almost magical in that flickering half-light. You can almost hear it, the creak of wood, the slow voice saying, "Once, in the time of our grandfathers." Sparkle's engagement line: would you rather hear a ghost story or a love tale whispered beside a dying fire? Milky Way: the night workers. Not everyone had the luxury of segmented sleep. Some people lived by night. Bakers, for instance, started their day when everyone else's ended. They needed to knead, rise, and bake before dawn markets opened. In towns, you could often smell fresh bread before sunrise, one of the few comforting scents of medieval urban life. Then there were the watchmen, tasked with guarding sleeping towns. They carried lanterns and halberds, walking slow circuits through narrow streets. Bells marked the hours, and every toll reminded them that the rest of the world was dreaming. Miller's assistants tended water wheels by torchlight, ensuring nothing jammed. Monks and nuns rose for midnight prayers, their chants echoing through cold cloisters. Even shepherds on hills kept vigil, guarding flocks from wolves. To them, night wasn't silence, it was duty. But there were others, of course, who moved through darkness with less holy purpose. Thieves preferred the night. So did smugglers and secret lovers. The same shadows that comforted bakers also hid danger. That's why medieval cities enforced curfews, the ringing of a bell to mark when honest folk should be home. After that, being caught in the streets could mean suspicion or arrest. In Paris, night watchmen even carried clappers, wooden rattles, to warn criminals that they were near. A sort of medieval flashlight, but louder. And yet, people still ventured out. Because even in the darkest centuries, curiosity never slept. Sparkle's engagement line: would you dare sneak out after curfew in a medieval town, or would you stay by the fire and bolt the door? Kindle the light of the night. We take electric light for granted. But to medieval people, light was sacred, rare, flickering, precious. Candles were expensive. Most peasants relied on rushlights, thin reeds dipped in animal fat, smoky and short-lived. They gave off more smell than brightness. Only the wealthy could afford beeswax candles, reserved for churches and feast days. In a peasant home, the only steady glow came from the fire. It was the heart of life: heat, cooking, protection, and company. The hearth's faint glow was the first thing a newborn saw, and the last thing a dying elder gazed upon. By that faint red light, families whispered prayers, carved tools, or mended clothes. In the silence of the watch, it felt almost alive. People believed spirits gathered near firelight, the household guardians, the ancestors, the unseen protectors of home. If a log popped unexpectedly, someone might cross themselves. You never knew who was listening. Sparkle's engagement line: "Do you think we lost something when we replaced firelight with electric bulbs?" All the sounds of the night. To live without modern noise is to rediscover how loud silence can be. The medieval night wasn't empty, it was full of small sounds: the hoot of owls, the creak of wood, the distant bark of a dog. Sometimes wolves howled from the forest's edge, and people shivered under their blankets. Thunder was terrifying. Without science, lightning was divine wrath. A storm at midnight could drive families to their knees in prayer. Bells were rung in church towers to chase away storms, as if sound itself could defend against lightning. But the most haunting sounds came from within: the whisper of sleeping children, the crack of settling beams, the slow rhythm of breathing. In those hours, the world felt alive, not empty, but watching. No wonder folklore thrived in the dark. Sparkle's engagement line: "If you lived in a silent, candlelit village, would the night comfort you, or scare you?" A night belongs to the strange. Every culture has its monsters, and medieval Europe had plenty. The night was their realm: ghosts wandering churchyards, will-o'-the-wisps luring travelers, witches flying to Sabbaths. Peasants told tales of the wild hunt, a spectral army of the dead that thundered across the sky on stormy nights. To see it was an omen of death. Even perfectly normal things, mists, moonlight, fox cries, could become signs of the supernatural. Traveling after dark was dangerous for practical reasons too: no lamps, no roads, no police. Bandits and wild animals made sure of that. So people stayed close to the hearth and shut their doors tightly. Night belonged to those brave, desperate, or foolish enough to claim it. Would you ever walk through a medieval forest at midnight, just to see what the legends were about? Kindle faith in the darkness. Religion, of course, touched everything, even sleep. Church bells marked the passing hours. In monasteries, monks woke for vigils and matins, their chants drifting into the cold air. The idea was that even as the world slept, prayer continued, a never-ending rhythm of devotion. Ordinary people, too, saw night as a time for spiritual protection. Before bed, they prayed to keep evil dreams and wicked spirits away. Some hung sprigs of herbs, rosemary, juniper, above doors or near pillows. A candle might burn all night beside the bed, both for light and blessing. And if someone died in their sleep, the family would leave the window open, to let the soul fly out. There's something strangely comforting about that, the thought that faith and fear coexisted so quietly in the medieval dark. Would you feel safer sleeping with a candle burning beside you, or in total darkness? Then, slowly, the world shifted. The rooster crowed. The mist turned pale. Somewhere, the baker's loaves were finished, the monks had ended their prayers, and the first smoke of morning curled from chimneys. The second sleep faded, and life began again, the same routine, the same survival, the same little comforts that made winter bearable. And maybe, as someone stirred the ashes to light the fire, they thought about the dream they'd had during that second sleep. Maybe it lingered, a soft echo of the night's mysteries. Morning wasn't bright and golden. It was gray, cold, and slow. But it was life. And for the medieval peasant, that was enough. When you think about it, their nights weren't so different from ours. They lay awake worrying, whispered stories, tended their little fires, and dreamed of warmer days. We may have central heating, electricity, and alarms, but deep down, we're still those same fragile creatures trying to find comfort in the dark. The difference is, we've forgotten how to listen to it. So maybe, one of these nights, turn off your phone. Light a candle. Let the darkness breathe a little. Somewhere in that silence, you might hear the echo of those old midnight hours, the watch between two sleeps, when the world paused, and everything felt ancient and alive. If you could spend one night in a medieval cottage, fire crackling, snow outside, would you dare close your eyes? Hey again, friend. If you're still here, either you really love history, or you've simply given up on sleep. Either way, welcome back to the Middle Ages, where dawn didn't so much arrive as it crept in reluctantly, like a cat that didn't want to be there. Because waking up in a medieval stone house was not pleasant. The air bit. The walls sweated cold. The fire, which had burned bravely through the night, had usually collapsed into a mound of gray ash. The first task of the morning wasn't stretching or checking your phone, it was survival. The rooster's crow wasn't poetic. It was loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. If you were lucky, the rooster belonged to you. If not, it belonged to your neighbor, who had absolutely no sense of mercy. The peasant family stirred beneath the heavy covers of wool and rough linen. Children blinked awake, clutching at warmth that was already leaving their bodies. You didn't rise in a medieval morning, you peeled yourself from sleep. The first few breaths were sharp and visible. Frost sometimes coated the inside of windows, or the iron latch on the door. The floor, made of packed earth, was so cold it could make bare feet ache within seconds. So most people didn't rush to get up. They huddled together, sometimes for another half hour, waiting for whoever was brave enough to rekindle the fire. There was always one hero in every house, often the mother or eldest son, who shuffled out of bed to stir the embers, blow life into coals, and add kindling until the faint orange glow returned. Only then did the day begin. Would you volunteer to be the first one up to light the morning fire, or pretend to still be asleep? Fire, the resurrection of the fire. The hearth wasn't just the center of the home, it was the center of existence. Without it, there was no warmth, no food, no comfort. Every morning was a small resurrection, the household gathering around the fragile flames like disciples around a miracle. To restart the fire, someone first sifted through last night's ashes, searching for faintly glowing embers. If there were none, they'd use a flint and steel, sparks, smoke, muttered curses, and the faint smell of singed fingers. When the first curl of flame appeared, there was relief. Then came the chores, adding larger sticks, setting a pot of water to heat, perhaps throwing in a handful of oats for the morning porridge. By then, the others had crawled from bed, sleepy, shivering, and wrapped in blankets like medieval burritos. Someone might open the door just long enough to let the night out. And as the faint blue of dawn crept across the floor, the house began to hum with life again. How long do you think you'd last without matches? Could you coax a fire from cold ashes? Breakfast wasn't the grand affair we imagine. It was practical, plain, and often eaten standing. In fact, the very word breakfast was rare. Many people didn't eat until several hours after sunrise. Those who did might have a crust of bread dipped in ale, or a bowl of thick, grayish porridge. Sometimes cheese, if there was any left. Sometimes onions. Sometimes nothing at all. The idea of bacon and eggs was a distant dream for peasants, those were luxuries. Meat was precious, salt expensive, and oil rare. Most families depended on the same staples every day: bread, gruel, and a little hope. But if the morning was cold enough, and it often was, they made exceptions. Warm food, even simple, filled the stomach and quieted the complaints of children. The smell of oats and smoke became the perfume of morning life. For drink, there was ale, weak, cloudy, and slightly sour. Water wasn't always safe, especially in towns. Everyone, from toddlers to grandmothers, drank a little beer every day. Not to get drunk, but to stay alive. So yes, medieval mornings started with fire, bread, and a light buzz. Which, to be fair, doesn't sound all that different from ours. Would you rather start your day with medieval ale or a strong modern coffee? For peasants, there was no such thing as taking your time. The day's work began as soon as there was light to see by, sometimes before. Women swept floors, fetched water from wells, fed animals, and spun wool by the fire. Men checked tools, mended harnesses, and stepped outside to face the cold fields. The morning was a time of motion. Doors creaked open, animals stirred, smoke curled from roofs. From a distance, a village waking up looked like a quiet miracle, a few dozen homes exhaling life back into the gray dawn. Children, of course, had no alarm clocks, only their mothers' hands shaking them awake. And they, too, had chores. Feeding chickens. Gathering kindling. Collecting water. Childhood in medieval Europe was not for the lazy. Even the smallest hands had a purpose. Would you have survived medieval mornings, or quietly run away from all that work? Now, about hygiene, because surely you're wondering. No, they didn't bathe every day. Or every week. Sometimes, not every season. But that doesn't mean they didn't wash. Morning washing rituals were surprisingly consistent, if simple. A small basin of cold water sat near the hearth. Each person took a turn splashing their face, hands, and sometimes hair. Soap, made from lye and animal fat, was used sparingly, both because it was harsh and because it was precious. Teeth brushing? Rare. Though they might rub them with cloth or twigs. Hair was combed, often to remove more than just tangles. And clothes, heavy wool, rarely laundered, were aired out near the fire. So yes, the medieval morning smelled earthy. A mix of wood smoke, damp wool, and humanity. But everyone smelled the same, so no one minded. There's something humbling about that, isn't there? No obsession with freshness, no fragrance marketing, just the natural scent of existence. If you had to live 1 week without modern soap or showers, do you think you could handle it? Sun behind small cloud, the light returns. By now, the sun would finally be rising, not dramatically, but cautiously. In winter, daylight came late and weak, as if uncertain whether to bother. The first real light fell across the hearth, turning the ashes silver. Smoke rose through the thatched roof, escaping through cracks or a simple hole. Birds began their morning arguments in the hedges. If it was market day, people bundled goods into baskets, eggs, herbs, coarse cloth, and started walking to the nearest town. If it was just another workday, men trudged to the fields with tools slung over their shoulders, boots sinking into the frost. The rhythm was ancient. The village emptied out toward labor, leaving only the very young, the very old, and the hearth. From the outside, it might have looked bleak. But to them, it was life, dependable, sacred in its repetition. Would you find peace in that kind of predictable routine, or would you crave something more? Thread the firekeeper. Every home had one guardian of warmth. Usually the mother, or grandmother, someone who understood that the fire was more than flame. It was continuity. Before the family left, she made sure the embers were banked, covered in ash so they'd smolder all day without burning out. When everyone returned, those same embers could be stirred back to life. It was almost spiritual. To lose the home fire was a kind of shame. It meant asking a neighbor for coals, a small, embarrassing admission of failure. But it also meant connection, because no one refused warmth. In this way, fire linked the whole village, each house glowing faintly, each family keeping the same fragile miracle alive. We might laugh now at how primitive that sounds, but it's oddly poetic. Imagine an entire valley lit not by electric light, but by hundreds of tiny orange hearts, each one a family's hope against the cold. If your entire winter survival depended on one small fire, how carefully would you protect it? The silence between tasks. Once the first chores were done and the morning truly began, there was often a moment of stillness. A rare pause before the fields demanded attention, before the noise of the day began. People might sit for a moment by the door, looking at the sky, gauging the weather. The crackling of the fire and the occasional moo from the cows were the only sounds. It wasn't peace in the modern sense, they weren't meditating or sipping coffee, but it was something deeper. A simple awareness, we survived another night. In an age where every dawn was uncertain, that was enough reason for quiet gratitude. If you woke up in a stone cottage tomorrow morning, what would you miss most from your modern life? Sheaf of rice to march into the day. And then, with the faint light growing stronger, the spell of the night broke. Men picked up their tools. Women tied scarves, gathered baskets. Doors opened. The day began. Outside, the frost glittered on fields and thatch. Breath turned to clouds. Somewhere, a dog barked, and the first blow of an axe echoed through the still air. For medieval peasants, there was no weekend, no pause button. Life continued, endlessly cycling through dawns and dusks, cold and warmth, hunger and plenty. But there's a certain beauty in that rhythm, an honesty we've lost in our glowing, heated homes. They faced the day with what they had, smoke in their hair, bread in their hands, and faith in the small fire that had survived another night. That, perhaps, is how they did it, how they slept in stone houses without freezing to death. Not through comfort, but through community. Not through luxury, but through routine. And in some quiet way, that might be warmer than anything else. Do you think you could live that way, with nothing but routine, faith, and fire to get you through the cold? The deeper we drift into the Middle Ages, the clearer it becomes that sleeping wasn't merely a necessity, it was a performance. Even among those who barely survived winter, sleep carried social meaning. To close one's eyes beneath a roof was to belong somewhere, to have a place in the world's fragile order. But the further you climbed up the social ladder, the more absurdly complicated that simple act became. For peasants, a bed was a pile of straw, shared and humble. For nobles, it became a throne made horizontal. By the late medieval period, the aristocratic bed wasn't just where you slept, it was where you lived, negotiated, received guests, and occasionally died. Royal chambers, especially in France and England, were part bedroom, part stage. Visitors entered not to watch someone sleep, but to witness the ceremony surrounding it. Courtiers gathered as the king was put to bed, a phrase that sounds almost childish now but was treated with reverence. He would be helped out of his outer garments, offered prayers, and carefully tucked beneath embroidered sheets as if the entire nation might collapse should the blanket slip. And yet, the irony remains, most of those kings couldn't sleep at all. They suffered from gout, indigestion, insomnia, or the simple paranoia that comes from ruling through fear. So while peasants snored in smoky cottages, dreaming peacefully beneath thatch, their monarchs lay awake in silk, sweating under ermine, haunted by ghosts of both the living and the dead. It's comforting, in a way, to know that even the most powerful couldn't buy a good night's sleep. Would you rather sleep soundly on straw or toss and turn on gold-threaded linen? Those extravagant beds were marvels of craftsmanship. Four-poster frames of oak or walnut, carved with saints, vines, and grotesques. Curtains heavy enough to block drafts, and perhaps to muffle awkward sounds. The mattress, if you could call it that, was layered with down, feathers, or wool. Servants fluffed it daily, shaking out the lumps like clouds in training. Pillows were a luxury, only the highborn rested their heads on softness. And still, comfort eluded them. Fireplaces roared but barely reached beyond the bed curtains. Winter nights in a castle were not cozy, they were freezing, echoing caverns of stone. The breath of servants frosted the air as they carried braziers from one chamber to the next. Royal fingers went numb writing letters by candlelight. Some kings even slept with their crowns nearby, just in case someone forgot who was freezing to death in style. Would you keep the fire going all night if it meant smoke filling the room, or let it die and wake to the sting of frozen air? Peasants, for all their lack of luxury, had something better: proximity. They slept close together, out of necessity, yes, but also warmth. A family might pack into a single bed, or two if they were lucky. Grandparents near the hearth, parents in the middle, children along the edges. Occasionally even a guest or laborer found space somewhere in the tangle. The idea of privacy simply didn't exist. Sleep was communal, intimate, and unremarkable. Bodies kept bodies alive. When one person turned, the others turned with them, a slow synchronized dance of survival. And when the fire burned low, someone's arm would instinctively pull another closer. It wasn't romantic, not really. Just practical. A shared heartbeat in the dark. Would you feel safer sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your entire family, or alone in silence? For travelers, inns provided yet another version of this communal chaos. Beds were shared among strangers, yes, truly shared. You might lie down beside a merchant you'd never met, or a pilgrim who hadn't bathed since Easter. The phrase "to sleep tight" came from the ropes that held the mattress platform together. The tighter the ropes, the less likely you'd roll into your neighbor. Privacy came at a price, and most couldn't afford it. So they made do. There are records of entire dormitories filled with travelers snoring in unison, the air thick with sweat, ale, and candle smoke. A lullaby of humanity. Would you dare fall asleep in a room full of strangers if it meant a warm fire and a roof above your head? Back in peasant cottages, beds were sometimes built directly into the wall, wooden boxes with sliding doors to keep heat in. In colder regions like Scotland or the Alps, these were essential. You could close yourself inside, almost like a coffin with blankets, and survive the night's bitterest winds. Children sometimes slept in drawers beneath the parents' bed, literal bed drawers. It sounds odd now, but for them it was safety and closeness. And when a baby was born, that same bed became a cradle, a sickbed, and eventually the deathbed. Life, in a medieval sense, was bookended by the same four boards. Would you want to sleep in a built-in wooden box bed if it meant never feeling the winter air on your face again? Of course, the nobility found a way to turn sleeping arrangements into social theater. The grandest rooms had not one bed but several. There was the lit de parade, the ceremonial bed, draped in brocade and seen by visitors, and the lit de repose, the private one where actual sleeping occurred. The first was for being seen. The second, for escaping from being seen. Imagine being a noble guest, ushered into a chamber to watch the king retire, only for him to rise again an hour later and shuffle into another room to find real rest. The performance of exhaustion must have been exhausting. Would you want to be important enough that even falling asleep required an audience? Meanwhile, peasants didn't have audience chambers, just creaky floors and the occasional mouse. Yet their nights were somehow fuller. They didn't need embroidered pillows to feel rich, they needed each other, the fire, and the hope that tomorrow wouldn't bring frostbite. The simplicity of that trade, luxury for warmth, privacy for survival, says a lot about the human condition. We chase comfort endlessly, yet the most comfortable people in history often lived the coldest nights. If you close your eyes now, imagine it. The faint hiss of logs, the scratch of straw under linen, the rhythm of quiet breathing all around you. The room smells of smoke and bread. Outside, the wind slides through the trees like a whisper. Inside, everything holds its breath together. That's what safety felt like, not silence, not space, but presence. Would you sleep better in noise and warmth, or in quiet and cold? Noble or poor, every medieval sleeper shared one truth: the dark was larger than they were. Night pressed in against windows, seeped through shutters, hid the world. But it also protected them. Daylight was duty, labor, survival. Night was reprieve, however rough. It's a strange comfort, knowing that somewhere in those centuries, people paused between toil and hunger to do the same thing we do now, close their eyes and trust that morning would come again. So maybe the answer to how they didn't freeze to death isn't clever engineering or perfect insulation. Maybe it's simpler. They endured together, under shared blankets, within thick walls built by tired hands, warmed by coals that never fully went out. Would you trade your modern bed for a night like that, uncomfortable, smoky, but filled with the soft murmur of human life all around you? Because the truth is, the warmth wasn't in the stone, or the straw, or the fire. It was in the people. In the closeness. In the shared act of surviving another night. And in that, maybe they slept more soundly than we do now. As winter deepened across the medieval landscape, night stretched longer and longer, swallowing nearly half the day. It wasn't just a season, it was an occupation. Surviving cold months required planning, endurance, and a certain resignation to discomfort. And for peasants, the cold wasn't something to fight, it was something to live with. You didn't win against it, you simply negotiated. The rhythm of medieval sleep changed with the seasons. In the summer months, peasants often went to bed late, after the fields had been watered and the animals settled. They rose early, with the faint gray of dawn, when dew still clung to the grass and mist rolled low over the land. In winter, though, sleep expanded. Nights could last 16 hours in northern regions, and people adapted by breaking that darkness into two halves, first sleep and second sleep. It sounds almost poetic, but it was just practical. After supper and prayers, families would crawl into bed around 8 or 9. They'd sleep a few hours, then wake near midnight, not in panic or confusion, but calmly, as though it were part of the plan. Some tended fires, others whispered quietly, or even prayed in the stillness. It was a sacred interval, a space between dreams. Then, after an hour or two, they'd return to their beds and sleep until dawn. Would you enjoy that, waking halfway through the night to think, to breathe, and then drifting off again when the world was silent? That watch between sleeps had a strangely gentle rhythm. Historians believe it might have been one of the few times medieval people had to themselves. The day was labor, the evening was family, but the night's midpoint, that was personal. People reflected, tended to the fire, or even wandered outside. There are accounts of peasants visiting neighbors during those hours, quietly knocking on doors to share gossip under the stars. It was the medieval version of checking your messages before bed. And though it sounds eerie to us, it wasn't frightening to them. The darkness was familiar. They didn't see it as dangerous so much as holy. Night belonged to God, and dreams were believed to be a form of divine whispering, or sometimes a warning. Would you listen to your dreams more closely if you believed they might be messages from heaven? Medieval people certainly did. Dream interpretation was both art and anxiety. A dream of water might mean birth or cleansing, a dream of falling could signal moral failure. Some even kept informal dream diaries, often in the margins of prayer books, noting what visions they saw between first and second sleep. A farmer might dream of wolves and worry about lost livestock. A widow might dream of her husband and take it as comfort, or a reminder to pray harder. Their dreams were shaped by hunger, candlelight, and cold. When you sleep in a freezing room, the mind invents warmth. So dreams were full of feasts, fires, and sunlight. It's easy to imagine a peasant half-waking at midnight, watching frost creep across the window, and thinking, perhaps the dream was better than waking. Would you rather wake from a beautiful dream to a cold room, or stay asleep and never know the difference? Superstition wrapped around sleep like an extra blanket. Peasants often feared night air, the belief that sickness traveled on the chill breeze. Windows were shut tight, shutters barred, and doors sealed with straw. Even wealthy households burned herbs at night, like rosemary or juniper, not for scent but protection. Bad air, they thought, brought fevers and madness. So they smudged their rooms, hung dried plants above doors, and prayed against unseen illnesses that lurked beyond the walls. And yet, ironically, by trapping in the smoke and damp, they created the very sickness they feared. The human mind, though, has always preferred control to logic. A handful of herbs could make one feel safe in ways science never could. Would you risk fresh air for comfort, or keep the world out entirely? Sleep wasn't just rest, it was vulnerability. To close your eyes in a time before locks, before medicine, before light, that was trust. Trust in the fire, in your family, and in whatever higher power you believed watched over the dark. For that reason, bedtime prayers were deeply ingrained. One popular medieval verse went, "I lay me down this night to sleep, and give my soul to Christ to keep." Simple words, repeated nightly by people who genuinely feared they might not wake again. They weren't being melodramatic. Fires went out, roofs caved in, sickness swept through in silence. To go to sleep was to surrender control completely. But that surrender, too, brought peace. Would you pray more sincerely if every night felt like it could be your last? Even noble families weren't exempt from superstition. Kings had their own bedtime rituals, complex, ceremonial acts of protection. Before retiring, some rulers insisted that the royal chaplain bless the bedchamber, sprinkle holy water over the pillows, and mark the door with a cross. Henry VIII reportedly had servants check under his bed each night for assassins. Charles VI of France, convinced he was made of glass, refused to move once he lay down, terrified he'd shatter. The irony? He was still called Charles the Beloved. It seems the richer the person, the more elaborate the bedtime paranoia. Would you sleep peacefully if every creak of wood sounded like a conspiracy? Down in the villages, people relied on simpler methods. Some left a small candle burning, believing light could ward off evil. Others placed iron objects, a knife, a nail, even a horseshoe, near the bed to keep away spirits. Cats were both feared and cherished. One might sleep near the hearth, half pet, half talisman. In parts of rural France, mothers drew small crosses on their children's foreheads before bed to protect their dreams. It was a strange blend of faith and folk magic, half religion, half instinct. You never knew what might work, so you tried everything. And in that layering of faith, humanity feels so familiar. We may no longer fear demons at the door, but we still keep nightlights, lock screens, and rituals of our own. Would you keep a candle burning if you thought it could keep nightmares away? The connection between cold, superstition, and sleep ran deeper than we might expect. Medieval thinkers believed that cold air thickened the humors, those mysterious bodily fluids that supposedly balanced health and temperament. Too much cold could make one melancholic, sluggish, even mad. So warmth wasn't just comfort, it was medicine. Fires weren't only for light, but for sanity. A chill night could be blamed for a bad mood. A shiver could mean a curse. And so people huddled closer, tended the embers, and murmured charms under their breath. Survival wasn't only physical, it was spiritual. Every night was a small test of faith, a private ritual of endurance. Would you find comfort in those tiny rituals, even knowing they might not truly work? In monastic communities, sleep took on yet another meaning, one of discipline. Monks rose several times each night for prayers, breaking their rest deliberately. The freezing stone corridors of abbeys echoed with soft footsteps and whispered Latin hymns. To deny the body comfort was seen as a way to strengthen the soul. Imagine shivering through matins at 2 a.m., half asleep, half holy. Sleep, in that sense, wasn't indulgence, it was resistance. To sleep too well was a sin of sloth. And yet, monks were still human. Many nodded off mid-prayer, or secretly tucked closer to a brazier than the rule allowed. Even sanctity couldn't conquer the chill entirely. Would you have the strength to wake for prayer in the middle of a freezing night? The idea of comfort itself was relative. To us, the medieval world seems unbearably harsh, but to them, it was simply the world. They measured warmth not by temperature, but by comparison. If the fire burned all night, you were lucky. If you woke with all your toes, blessed. If you had bread and company by morning, that was wealth enough. Maybe that's the quiet beauty in their endurance. Sleep wasn't something to optimize, track, or measure. It was a fragile, nightly act of faith. And each dawn, no matter how cold, was proof that the system worked, that life, however small, could persist. Would you trade our comfort for their certainty, that if you woke at all, it was by grace, not luck? And as the long winter nights stretched on, so did their patience. In those centuries before modern heat, before glass windows or insulated walls, every flicker of firelight felt like hope itself. A family sleeping under one roof wasn't just staying warm. They were keeping something much rarer alive, the quiet belief that together, they could outlast the dark. Would you rather chase perfect sleep alone, or share imperfect warmth with others? That's how medieval peasants, and nobles, and monks, made peace with the night, through faith, habit, and a stubborn refusal to stop trying. Every superstition, every ritual, every prayer was a small act of defiance against the cold. And in that defiance, they found meaning. Would you light your own small candle tonight, just to feel a little closer to them? By now, you might be wondering what medieval people actually did before bed, besides piling on every blanket they owned and whispering the occasional prayer against freezing solid. The truth is, their nightly routines were built on rhythm and repetition, small acts that softened the edge of exhaustion. They didn't have evening entertainment as we do now. There was no glowing screen, no endless scroll, only firelight, family, and the quiet sound of daily labor ending. After supper, the house would dim. Oil lamps or rushlights burned low, casting strange, wobbly shadows across the walls. These weren't bright, cheery flames, they flickered like uncertain thoughts, feeding on tallow or leftover fat from cooking. A single candle had to last hours, so families made the light stretch thin. They worked, sewed, sharpened tools, or simply sat together, waiting for their eyes to adjust to the dark. There was something deliberate in the slowness. The world got quieter, narrower. Evenings were not meant to be stimulating, they were meant to fade. Would you fall asleep faster if your nights were made of silence and candlelight, instead of screens and sound? Food played a quiet but crucial role in how well people slept. A peasant's supper wasn't heavy with bread, a little cheese, maybe some onions or pottage if they were lucky. Richer households, of course, indulged in roasted meats and ale. But overindulgence was risky. Medieval medicine, governed by the theory of the four humors, insisted that eating too late, or too much, made bad vapors rise to the head, disturbing sleep. It wasn't entirely wrong. A full stomach can make anyone restless, but their remedies were amusingly extreme. Doctors advised eating lettuce or vinegar to cool the blood before bed. Some recommended roasted dormice, yes, dormice, as a light supper that calms the humors. Others swore by wine mixed with poppy syrup, which sounds peaceful until you realize it was essentially an ancient sleep aid laced with narcotics. Would you try a medieval sleep potion if it promised a dreamless night? For peasants, wine and poppy syrup were out of reach. Instead, they relied on ale, thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, or simple herbal teas made from chamomile, valerian, or mint. These plants grew easily, even near poor cottages, and so became the quiet healers of the night. A cup of warm brew before bed, shared between husband and wife, might have been their only luxury. Herbal wisdom passed mostly through women. Mothers taught daughters how to dry and store leaves, which herbs soothed fever, and which brought sleep. The knowledge was local, personal, and deeply trusted. A modern doctor might call it placebo, a medieval one would have called it mercy. Would you feel safer knowing your grandmother's hands mixed your medicine instead of a pharmacy label? As the night deepened, fires were banked carefully. You didn't just let a hearth die out, that would be wasteful, even dangerous. Someone, usually the last awake, would rake the embers into a small pile, cover it with ashes, and leave a few coals glowing under the surface. By morning, they could be revived with breath and kindling. This sleeping fire was like a quiet heartbeat at the center of the home. It watched over the family, unseen but warm. In noble households, servants handled the ritual. In peasant cottages, it was often the mother. She'd whisper a prayer to the Virgin Mary while tucking the fire in for the night, yes, tucking it in, almost as if it were another child. The words varied by region, but many were simple blessings like, "May the holy fire sleep, and wake in peace." Would you sleep better knowing the last thing you did each night was to whisper to the fire? Night wasn't just a pause between days, it was a world of its own. Every sound carried meaning. A dog barking could mean wolves, or simply a spirit wandering by. The creak of wood might be the wind, or something older. People didn't separate the physical and the spiritual as we do now, everything was connected. Cold drafts were thought to be the breath of ghosts. Strange dreams could be signs from saints. The veil between the living and the dead, they said, was thinnest at night, especially in winter, when the earth slept too. Would you dare to blow out your candle in that kind of darkness? Many families kept small charms near their beds, relics, beads, or bits of bone wrapped in cloth. To modern eyes, they look like trinkets. But to them, they were armor. One popular object was a sleep stone, often just a smooth pebble or carved piece of jet. People believed holding it in your hand while falling asleep protected the soul during dreams. Another was a sprig of rosemary under the pillow, for remembrance and safety. Some might smile at the superstition, but it reveals something deeply human, the longing to make the unseen less frightening. Would you keep a lucky charm by your pillow if it promised sweet dreams? Sleep wasn't always peaceful, though. The medieval night was full of interruptions, not just from the cold or the creaks, but from life itself. Babies cried. Chickens fluttered in rafters. A cask might leak, a mouse might scurry across the floor. And outside, animals called to each other in the dark, oxen shifting in barns, owls hunting, dogs answering distant howls. The world was never entirely still. Yet, for those used to it, the noise became part of the lullaby. Silence, after all, wasn't natural. The living world always murmured, always breathed. Would you rather sleep in perfect quiet or surrounded by the gentle sounds of life moving in the dark? As the night wore on, warmth became a constant battle. Even with thick blankets, cold crept through stone floors and thin walls. Some peasants heated stones in the hearth before bed, wrapping them in cloth to place under the covers, the medieval version of a hot water bottle. Wealthier people had bed warmers, metal pans filled with embers, slid under sheets to chase away the chill. They worked well, until they didn't. Many beds caught fire that way. Still, the promise of a few minutes of heat was worth the risk. The memory of warmth could last longer than the warmth itself. Would you risk a little danger for a brief moment of comfort? Dreams, once they came, were vivid, shaped by hunger, fatigue, and imagination. A peasant might dream of summer fields and wake to frost on the rafters. A noble might dream of divine judgment after feasting too well. Sometimes dreams were communal, told aloud in the morning, shared like gossip or confession. In a world with little privacy, even dreams belonged to everyone. And yet, those dreams helped people endure. A good dream was a small gift, a bad one, a warning. It was their version of mental weather, unpredictable, but worth noting. Would you tell your dreams if you thought your neighbors could interpret them for you? Eventually, dawn arrived. Not suddenly, but gradually, like a soft return to reality. Smoke thinned, roosters stirred, and the air changed. Someone rose to stir the ashes, coaxing life back into the fire. The coldest hour was over. Morning meant movement again, feeding animals, fetching water, preparing bread. The night, with all its strange rituals and quiet fears, faded into routine. People rarely spoke about sleep directly, it was too ordinary, too constant. But their actions around it, the prayers, the herbs, the warmth, revealed how deeply they valued it. They may not have understood dreams as we do, but they understood rest, the absolute necessity of stopping, even for a few hours, in a life of endless work. Would you value sleep more if it were your only true luxury? And perhaps that's what makes the medieval night so oddly comforting to imagine. It was imperfect, noisy, smoky, often uncomfortable, but it belonged entirely to the people who lived it. There was no clock to beat, no alarm to dread. Just the slow surrender of one day to the next, the steady rhythm of survival. Even now, centuries later, you can almost hear it, the sigh of a cottage settling, the crackle of a dying fire, the whisper of straw shifting under tired bodies. Maybe, in some quiet corner of history, a family is still asleep there, frozen in time, perfectly at peace, unaware that their humble routines would someday fascinate strangers from the future. Would you trade your world of glowing devices for one night in theirs, just to hear that silence again? So when we ask how medieval peasants slept in stone houses without freezing to death, the real answer might be this: they didn't avoid the cold, they made peace with it. They learned to live beside it, breathe it, and even dream through it. Would you be able to do the same? As we drift further into the medieval night, the question of sleep begins to blur with something heavier: survival, sickness, and sin. Because in a world where medicine was mostly prayer and hope, the bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a battlefield. For peasants, a bed was where life began and ended. It was where children were born, fevers were fought, and, often, where people died. Hospitals, as we think of them now, barely existed outside monasteries. So illness was managed at home, in the same smoky rooms where people ate, prayed, and slept. There was no clean division between the living and the dying. They shared the same air. Imagine lying in bed, feverish, wrapped in wool that smelled faintly of smoke, with your family gathered around, whispering psalms and folk cures. There was comfort in it, yes, but also a quiet dread. The medieval bed was never entirely your own, it belonged equally to sleep, sickness, and the soul. Would you feel comforted or terrified, knowing that the same bed might cradle you both in dreams and in death? When plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, sleep itself became suspicious. People feared the night air might carry pestilence, that darkness was somehow contagious. Many refused to close their windows, believing the wind could cleanse their homes, though it only brought in more chill. Others burned vinegar, herbs, or even tar to purify the air. None of it worked, of course. But it gave a sense of control, however illusory. There are stories of families lying together in silence, too weak to rise, clinging to warmth while listening to church bells toll for the dead. Those nights were endless. The line between sleep and death blurred completely. Would you have the courage to close your eyes if you weren't sure you'd open them again? Even outside the Great Plagues, illness was constant: fevers, coughs, infections. Medieval doctors, limited by humoral theory, often prescribed bizarre sleep-related treatments. To cure melancholy, they suggested sleeping on rose petals. For gout, elevating the legs toward God. For hysteria, inhaling burnt feathers before bed. None of it sounds restful, though perhaps the confusion alone might tire you into slumber. The wealthy could afford physicians, the poor relied on healers and midwives, whose methods were both practical and mystical. A common peasant remedy for sleeplessness involved tying a small sack of crushed poppy heads to the wrist, an early, mildly narcotic wearable, centuries before smart watches. Would you tie a pouch of poppies to your wrist if it promised you a full night's sleep? In monasteries, sickness was treated differently. There, sleep was both cure and temptation. Monks suffering fever were allowed extra rest, but always under watchful eyes. Too much sleep, even while ill, risked the sin of sloth. They were told to pray as much as they could from bed, whispering psalms between shivers. Sometimes a fellow monk would sit nearby, reading aloud softly, half nurse and half priest. It must have been a strange comfort, the sound of Latin murmured into the dark, echoing off cold stone walls. Would you find peace in a voice reciting prayers beside your bed, or would the words keep you awake? Among nobles, beds became almost sacred objects of illness. The sickroom was rearranged entirely to accommodate the invalid's comfort, or at least what passed for it. Curtains drawn tight, fire blazing, servants hovering with spiced wine and linen cloths. But medicine was guesswork. Leeches, bleeding, poultices made of bread and milk, all applied with great confidence and little effect. A nobleman might die surrounded by a dozen doctors, all disagreeing loudly about which humor had betrayed him. And yet, they clung to ceremony even in suffering. Kings didn't simply fall ill, they took to bed. Their recoveries, if they happened, were public miracles. Their deaths, long performances. In royal chronicles, you can trace each hour of a monarch's final sleep, as if the rhythm of his breath mattered to the realm itself. Would you want your final sleep witnessed, recorded, and analyzed by everyone around you? There's something touching, almost tragic, about how much meaning they placed in sleep. To rest well was to be right with God. To wake in pain was a sign of imbalance or sin. People sought not just physical warmth, but spiritual safety. They confessed before bed, not just out of piety, but precaution, because dying in one's sleep without absolution was considered dangerous for the soul. Children were taught nightly prayers that doubled as protection spells. If I should die before I wake, they murmured, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Sweet words now, but literal then. Every bedtime was an act of surrender, not just to fatigue, but to fate. Would you still say that prayer if you truly believed it might come true tonight? Peasants sometimes believed dreams could reveal sickness before symptoms began, the body's secret way of warning itself. A dream of drowning might foretell fever. A dream of teeth falling out could mean death nearby. These beliefs mixed medicine with mysticism in a way that feels both alien and oddly logical. When you had no thermometer, no diagnosis, dreams were your data. Of course, most dreams weren't prophetic. They were just the mind sorting through hunger, worry, and cold. Still, people recorded them when they could, monks in margins, wives in whispered recollection. One 13th-century English farmer noted in his will that he dreamed of the field of snow with one red rose the night before falling ill. To him, it wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. Would you trust your dreams to tell you when something was wrong? Even in times of illness, the communal nature of sleep persisted. A sick peasant rarely slept alone. Family members would lie beside them for warmth, even at risk of contagion. They didn't separate health from care, the comfort of being near someone mattered more than fear of infection. Perhaps they didn't understand germs, but they understood loneliness. Would you stay by someone's side, knowing you might fall ill too, just to keep them warm? Among the upper classes, isolation was more common. A sick noble might be quarantined in his bedchamber, visited only by servants or clergy. But even then, the bed remained central, both symbol and stage. Paintings from the era show dying nobles surrounded by priests, candles, and relatives, all staring solemnly as though sleep had turned into spectacle. The deathbed scene became one of medieval art's favorite motifs, the soul rising like a tiny naked figure toward heaven while the body remained still beneath embroidered sheets. To the medieval mind, that wasn't morbid, it was comforting. Death, like sleep, was a transition. The only difference was who woke you up afterward. Would you fear death less if you thought of it as just another kind of waking? And so, night after night, across centuries of cold, the medieval world lay down in its many beds, straw and silk, side by side. Some slept deeply. Some didn't sleep at all. Some never woke. But all shared the same fragile rituals, the banked fire, the whispered prayer, the hope that warmth and grace would last until morning. Even now, when you picture them, huddled families under wool blankets, monks pacing stone halls with candles, nobles sighing under velvet canopies, it's impossible not to feel a kind of kinship. The world has changed beyond recognition, but the longing hasn't. To be warm, to be safe, to rest without fear, those are still our quietest prayers. Would you find peace, you think, if you stripped away everything but the basics, a bed, a fire, and someone breathing softly beside you? It's strange to realize that the history of sleep is really just the history of hope. Each night, they closed their eyes, trusting in something they couldn't see, the fire, the dawn, or God. And every morning, when they opened them again, the world continued, imperfect, cold, and alive. So when we ask how they survived those stone houses and freezing nights, the truest answer isn't found in architecture or ingenuity. It's found in faith, not always religious, but faith nonetheless. Faith that the fire would still be glowing. That the frost would melt. That someone would still be there in the morning. Would you sleep better tonight, knowing people once faced far worse darkness, and still dreamed anyway? By now, the fire in our medieval cottage has burned low. The last bits of oak and peat crumble into a slow red glow. Shadows dance across the stone walls, gentle and tired, like they too are ready to rest. Somewhere, a rooster has crowed too early. Someone outside stirs, rubbing their hands against the cold, muttering that it's still night. But inside, our world is still half asleep, wrapped in the fragile warmth of routine. The medieval night was long, but never empty. Even in its quietest hours, there was the soft rhythm of breathing, human, animal, divine. A whole society bound together by the same pulse of dark and dawn. And as strange as it may sound, that rhythm was comforting. Predictable. The sun always rose, even after the hardest winters. The same way we close our eyes now, certain we'll open them again. Would you trust the sunrise if you had to live by faith alone? We've spent a long time drifting through this world, through thatched roofs and stone hearths, candlelight and superstition, straw beds and whispered prayers. But what lingers most isn't the cold or the poverty. It's the remarkable tenderness of people who made comfort out of almost nothing. They didn't have luxury, but they had closeness. They had the warmth of shared blankets, the reassurance of another heartbeat beside them. And that, perhaps, is the simplest kind of happiness, the one that doesn't require much at all. Would you trade your mattress for a straw bed if it meant sleeping surrounded by people who truly loved you? Even among the nobility, who had feather beds and velvet drapes, the desire was the same. To sleep well. To be safe. To wake to another morning of ordinary chaos. There's something beautifully humbling about that, the shared humanity between a peasant huddling by a dying fire and a queen resting under gilded silk. Both closed their eyes with the same hope, that tomorrow would be kind. Sometimes, I think about how the sounds of those nights must have overlapped, the barking of dogs in distant villages, the faint echo of church bells, the occasional thunder. For all their divisions and feuds, the medieval world slept beneath one continuous blanket of sound. The same night air passed through the cottages and castles alike. Would you sleep more peacefully knowing that everyone, rich, poor, saint, sinner, was breathing the same cold air? As time went on, the world changed. Chimneys improved, beds got higher, curtains heavier. Linen replaced rough wool, and pillows became softer. But even centuries later, the same questions persisted. How do we stay warm? How do we stay safe? How do we rest without worry? The medieval peasant's fears may feel distant, but our modern insomnia has its own kind of frost. We still huddle close to little sources of light, now glowing screens instead of hearths. We still listen for comfort, a voice, a story, a reminder that we're not alone in the dark. Maybe that's why these old histories matter so much. They remind us that sleep isn't just biological. It's emotional. It's communal. Would you feel less lonely knowing that somewhere, centuries ago, someone was lying awake for the same reasons you are? Even the silence had meaning back then. The absence of movement, of sound, of breath, it was reverent. In monasteries, the stillness of night was a kind of prayer. In homes, it was simply exhaustion, but still sacred in its own way. Sleep was surrender, and every surrender was holy. When you think of it like that, there's something profoundly gentle about how they lived, even amid hardship. Every night, they rebuilt hope from scratch. Every dawn, they began again. And maybe that's what keeps drawing us to their world, the quiet courage of people who didn't know if the harvest would last, or if spring would come, yet still closed their eyes and trusted that morning would be there. Would you have that kind of faith, to sleep not because the world is safe, but because you've chosen to believe it will be? If you listen closely, you can almost hear it now, the crackle of old fires, the sigh of wind through stone walls, the steady breathing of those who came before us. They're not so different, really. They were tired, like us. Hopeful, like us. Sometimes afraid, like us. And through it all, they kept sleeping. They made peace with the dark. Maybe that's the lesson hidden in their cold stone houses and smoky rafters, that comfort isn't always about warmth or wealth. Sometimes it's just about acceptance. Letting go. Knowing that the world outside might be cruel and frozen, but here, in this small corner, there is peace. Would you close your eyes a little easier tonight, knowing you're part of that same ancient pattern, the long story of humans just trying to rest? And so, we come to the end of our long drift through the medieval night. The candles have burned low. The fire has become quiet ash. The voices of history fade back into the dark. But the warmth remains, soft and persistent, the warmth of shared imagination, of wondering how they endured, and realizing that maybe we endure the same way. By finding light where there shouldn't be any. So, as you lie there now, maybe tucked under blankets, maybe scrolling one last time, take a deep breath. Let the medieval world fade gently out of focus. The stone walls, the straw beds, the whispered prayers. They've served their purpose. They've kept you company through another hour of night. Would you let them go now, and rest? If you're still awake, somehow, thank you for keeping me company tonight. If you've drifted off halfway through, that's fine too. That's exactly what this story was meant to do. And if you did make it this far, tell me in the comments, would you survive one night in a medieval peasant's cottage? Or would you rather brave the cold than share a bed with 4 snoring relatives and a chicken? Either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed our quiet journey through the frozen nights of the past, you can always leave a like. It tells me you'd like more tales like this one. Maybe subscribe if you'd like to fall asleep to history again sometime. And share it, perhaps, with someone who might need a slow, gentle story to drift off to tonight. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, traveler, and remember, no matter the century, no matter the cold, the dawn always comes.